Hello, my loves, and a happy Pride to you all. As you may hear, I've got a little bit of a cold. I'm on the outer edge of a pretty unpleasant plague-like infection, and no doubt some blessing from Father Nurgle for you Warhammer 40k fans out there. Oh, he does love me at the moment, I can tell you, which is a shame because I'm more of a Slaanesh guy. Anywho, yeah, happy Pride. It's an interesting season this time round. I would say that it's more important now than it has ever been, and it's more important that it becomes what it was originally intended as and what it was always meant to be, which is not just a protest but a consolidation. It's really important that public expressions like Pride exist at the moment, considering the manifold pressures that queer people are facing across the board and in from so many different areas and in so many different forms. It can be quite bewildering, and it can also be depressing and disheartening and very easy to retreat from. As those of you who know me will be aware, that's really not what I do, especially these days. I don't know why, but I've lost a lot of my inhibitions. That fear of confrontation is gone these days, especially over LGBTQ matters. I'm very ready to stand up and defend other people in this regard. And for me, that's kind of what it's about. They can't really hurt me. What are they going to do? It's always been that way for me. It's really rather interesting. I grew up in the late 80s and through the 90s. I was born in 1984, so I was a kid through the latter half of the 80s, but more so in the 1990s. It's that really strange generational no space, that sort of liminal space where you're in between Generation X and the millennials, but you're neither one nor the other, that kind of zennial space. So being queer in that period was really strange. And I kind of, even before I had the language to understand, or the contexts to understand, I knew I was queer. I knew I was gay. It was very clear to me from like the first instance, from the earliest instance, that I was not as other boys. I was not as most other boys. I was not as most other people. Um, and so I sought out those others who were not as other boys, who were not as other people. And as we do, we formed our own little strange, peculiar, imaginative tribes. It was very, very odd. But growing up queer during that period was very, very odd because I just missed that incredible danger point between like the late 1970s and late 1980s where it was very dangerous to be queer in the UK for a whole host of reasons, not just the fact of the AIDS epidemic, which I regard it as my duty as a gay man to go back and research and look at. I read loads of journals from that period. I try to talk to as many men from that period as I can, and I have met quite a few of them. And I feel it. I feel culturally obliged to understand their experience, to understand what it was like, and it was horrific. I mean, the not just the fact of the disease and the fear of it, and not knowing what it was, how it was striking, whether you would wake up the next day and find out that you'd got it, or friends had got it, or relatives had got it, or that they died in the night. One guy I spoke to a long time ago, he described just every day going through his phone book, because of course this is pre-mobile phones, by the way, guys. So you had a phone book of friends and contacts, and just crossing off entries, just crossing off friends as they were dying like daily, having to decide from one day to the next whose funeral you would go to, because there were so many occurring that you had to decide whose was more important to you because they overlapped. That's how bad it was. That sense of abandonment, I mean, that's the other thing. Whilst it was considered a queer disease, nobody gave two fucks. Nobody cared. The society and culture itself. In fact, there were vast sections of society and culture that absolutely regarded it as a blessing. It was like it was the judgment on the evil, salacious queers. There are even some from within our own communities who believe that, because we was such a, and we still are such a sexual and sort of hedonistic demographic, that somehow it was some kind of judgment for that, as though the I mean, Clive Barker, one of my icons who I cite so much, said this the best. He said that, a lingering, tortuous death sentence as the price for a little sex. I mean, how ridiculous. How utterly absurd. What kind of universe imposes that as a measure of judgment? It's insane. And the people who regard it in those terms are morally insane. There's no point in talking to them. They are morally insane. There's no reasoning with them. But yeah, I obviously avoided that. I wasn't sexually active during the 80s. I mean, I was 6 when the 80s ended, and grew up and grew into my gay identity through the 1990s, which was a very different time. You still had the lingering homophobia of the 70s and the 80s. It was still very much enshrined. Like at school, it was the worst thing. In high school, if you were classified as gay or queer, it was the worst thing, particularly for guys for some reason. There was a real, I mean, enshrined homophobia in school systems back then. It was the one thing that people avoided being defined as during that period, because it would make you a pariah. That would make you like it was the end of everything. There was no mention of it in school, in like education, in sex education, in biology, in anything like that. There was no mention of it. There was very little in the way of media that that included homosexual characters or spoke about homosexuality. I remember, I'm old enough now because I'm 41, guys. Where the fuck did that go? Jesus, I am like, in gay years, I'm ancient. I'm a daddy now, you know? I am very firmly in daddy territory, and I'm all right with that, quite frankly. Um, I remember those big cultural milestones. I remember there was a soap opera in the UK called Brookside, and Brookside was infamous because it was the soap that would always broach the really contentious subjects. It would always have story arcs that brought new material to popular television that no one had ever really done before. So you had the first lesbian relationship in Brookside, in like mainstream popular daytime television. You had things like there was an incestuous relationship in it. There was explorations of things like suicide and drug addiction and all sorts of stuff that was coined on that soap. And I remember the first lesbian relationship on that caused an absolute sensation. It was really culturally important. We had things like, this was much later on, we had things like Queer as Folk, which was the very first TV program that was written by a gay man, by Russell T Davis, who you know as, the from Doctor Who primarily. Um, it was the very first popular television program that was exclusively about gay characters, written by a gay man, and explored something about gay experience that was totally honest. It's a kind of warts and all thing where it dives deep into the hedonism and the sexualization of gay culture, because we are all guys, and when you get a lot of guys together who will have a sexual identity, then things happen. um it was really interesting. It was a cultural milestone. What Queer as Folk and shows like it did, because up until that point on mainstream British television, if you had a queer character, A, it was written by straight people for the most part, and B, it was a joke. Queer or queer coded characters were joke on British television. They were there for a laugh. They were is it Mr. Humphreys from that 1970s 1980s show? It's that character. It's the very stereotypical, very coded character. But through the late 80s into the 90s, you started to get this softening. You started to get this gradual sort of coming round period to the point where in the late 1990s, it was suddenly becoming quite chic to be openly gay. It was suddenly a thing that people would fight for, you know? And it was becoming much more acceptable in family structures. There was a lots more media around. I remember my first experience of queer representation in media was through literature, obviously, because that was my bag, that was my thing. Outside of queer-coded characters, which have always existed, by the way. You'll find queer-coded characters in everything. You'll find queer-coded characters in Disney films, for God's sake. But literature that explicitly dealt with queer characters and queer relationships, that I got from Barker, that I got from Billy Martin, aka Poppy Z. Bright, who was quite big at the time. And that was where I found my identification points. That was where I got the language from. Because it's a weird thing. You know you're queer, but you don't necessarily have the language for it. Even when you know what gay is or what queer is, you don't necessarily apply it to yourself. You just know that you're different. You just know that there's something not quite the same in you as there is in others. Um, it was literature that exposed me to those relationships, to that material, to those dynamics, and gave me the language to explain and explore it, to articulate it to myself. And that's a very interesting moment, I think, for a young gay person or a young queer person when that light goes on. And when you have that, oh, okay, that's what I am. That's the language. That's really interesting. And then, I mean, you can go people react differently, you can go any number of ways with it. I remember my reaction was just, "Oh, that's interesting." It wasn't, panic, it wasn't anxiety, it wasn't concern, and I think that's largely because I've never really cared about other people's judgments in that regard. I know that's a weird thing, but I haven't. I mean, I grew up in a working class, Midlands town, a working class Midlands family. My grandfather was a miner, my father was a butcher, my mom has done little odd jobs out here and there. I should not be as I am. As sort of cultural prescription goes, I should not be as I am. I should not be literate. I should not be articulate in the way that I am. I should not be interested in the things that I'm interested in. But because of weird circumstances and input, here I am on this podcast talking to you guys. It's really quite strange. I've always been fascinated by the things that make us what we are. I'm doing a psychology degree at the moment, by the way, and that's like developmental psychology is really interesting to me. The factors, the influences, the inputs, the context that shape our behaviors and our identities and the processes of our minds fascinate me. And so realizing that I was gay wasn't it was simultaneously a massive deal and not a massive deal. It's very ambiguous. So it was a massive deal for me, but I've always regarded it as that. I've always been rather jealous of it, you know? I don't give a fuck what other people think. I never have. It's a really strange situation. So I've never had like the big coming out thing because for me, and I'm only speaking personally here, for those for whom that is important, then you know, all support. I think that you know, it's one of those things that people need to decide for themselves how they express this. But for me, I've never cared over much, and that has continued. My relationships are mine, and I don't care what other people think. I don't care. I don't respect. I'm very misanthropic. I mean, part of me is very misanthropic, and that's an old thing. I've been sort of misanthropic ever since I was a kid. I've never really respected humanity that much. I know that sounds odd and awful, but it is absolutely true. And I haven't really respected those around me enough to care for their opinion on this matter. My relationships are my relationships, and people can fuck off with their judgments. Particularly, I think part of it is imagination. I have a very broad and fervent and perpetually active imagination. It's fucking exhausting, quite frankly, because I can't turn it off. My imagination is such that I cannot turn it off. I don't have the discipline. So it is full of scenarios and sights and sounds and sensations and strains of music and bits of film and bits of my own weird imagination and fantasies all the fucking time. And a byproduct of that is there's a degree of perception. I can look at I've done this ever since I was a kid. I look at people and I look at their relationships and I think, yeah, you are not in any particular place to judge me, are you? You know, I look at the straight relationships around me and I look at how many of them are so fucking unhappy and dysfunctional and problematic. And my immediate response is my relationships, whether they're casual hookups or whether they are protracted and prolonged relationships, are too good for you to judge. They are too meaningful to me. Because I can tell you this, even the like when I engage in casual sex or engagements, it's always very profound. It's always a very meaningful experience to me, you know? And that doesn't mean that I'm looking to make the other person like a relationship or anything like that. It's just the relationship and the immediate experience, the sensual experience is really profound for me. And it's meaningful and poetic and interesting. And I feel as though it often changes who I am. It changes the topography of my mind, whether it's casual or whether it's meaningful, you know? I don't always see that in my straight counterparts. I really, really don't. I often see relationships that have stagnated and probably shouldn't have existed in the first place, where they are dysfunctional and all they fucking do is carp and moan about one another. And they only stay together because they can't think of anything else or because they're codependent and they have no escape. Yeah, I have never sought judgment. So when they try, my immediate response is viciousness and laughter. It's fuck off. You can't judge me. You don't have any platform to judge me or my relationships, you know? And that has been the case from the very beginning. That really has been the case from the very beginning. I'm not that big on introducing my relationships to family, for example. I will, when the circumstance comes up, but it's not a big deal to me. It's just not a big deal. Again, one of the other elements, and this is not necessarily about being gay or queer, but it is part of it. I'm not big on family. I'm not big on family structures. That is something that has changed in queer culture over the decades, since like the late 80s up to this point. There are more queer people, certainly in this culture now, who are more part of their families and who operate more according to traditional family structures. And that's great. That's whatever floats your boat, whatever works for you. I'm not that way made. I don't know whether it's because of the age I am, and traditionally, queer people who were born like between the 60s and the late 80s have always been excluded from family on one level or another, sometimes very physically so, others in terms of the narrative and the structure of family, the implications of family. Whatever the case, the stark truth is our parents will always have more overlap and familiarity in terms of their experience with our straight siblings and cousins because their experiences are broadly similar. The narratives that apply to them are broadly similar, where they are not necessarily to us, although that is less the case now. And that's interesting because I find that creates distance. That creates distance. My family are better than most families regarding queerness and whatnot, than most families in their culture, in their class, their bracket, as it were. They're pretty good. They don't really give much of a shit. It's not much of a thing for them, to be perfectly honest. Um, but it is still true that I am more distant from them than my straight brother is, because my straight brother has more of an overlap with their experience. It's broadly the same. It's broadly similar, despite despite obvious discrepancies and differences, as all lives have from one another. It's broadly the same trajectory. You know, he's not married yet, but he's going to be. He has a daughter, my niece, and so on and so forth. There is more there in terms of family structure. Yeah, I find that I'm a bit of an alien, and some of that is the queerness, some of that is just me because it's my nature. It's the way I am. I don't like family atmospheres. I don't like that sort of imposed community. There's something very creepy about it. I don't Part of it is my interest in psychology, that's for damn sure, because dynamically, if you step back, if you have the capacity to step back and look at family structures as we understand them, the nuclear family, which by the way is bullshit. The nuclear family is an almost historically a new invention. It is not how we have historically functioned, how we have developed community, how we have been raised, and it fucks us over. It's one of those because I'm studying therapy as well. I want to be a counselor. Um, it's one of those unspoken little rules that we don't talk about in counseling and therapy. Family, as we understand it, is a fuck job on the psyche. It is the source of so many of our neuroses and problems and anxieties. And it's ambiguous, don't get me wrong. It is not absolute like a lot of things in psychology. There are ambiguities here. There are good things about the family structure, absolutely. But for the most part, it is a source of profound neurosis and anxiety. And it's because it's synthetic. The nuclear family, where families are their own little cults or kingdoms that exist in their own little closed off areas. That's not how we work as a species. It's not how we work as cultures. It never has been. It never should be. That cult of individualism, which is so very Western, that's not how we operate, my loves. That is not how we're supposed to function. We are supposed to be communal. We're supposed to be social. We're supposed to operate in slightly larger groups than this. Um, and when I step back from family and look at its dynamics and look at the way it operates, what I see is a microcosm of structures that we would otherwise condemn culturally. So things like cults, for example. The dynamics of a cult are exactly the same as the dynamics of a family. And I mean exactly the same. The hierarchies of power, the use of coercion, and conditioning to make people operate in a particular way. The dynamics are exactly the same. That doesn't mean that they are equally damaging. That's not the case. But it does give me pause. It makes me step back and look and think, yeah, I'm not sure I want to be a part of this. I really don't. I would prefer. I mean, there's so much in me that's utopian. I mean, I'm sexually utopian, and I don't. I'm also poly, which is an interesting state. It's an interesting condition to be in. I don't understand the parameters of a lot of relationships. I don't understand because just like the prescribed parameters of the nuclear family, I am of the opinion that the vast majority of us do not function very well in the way culture prescribes romantic and sexual relationships. That's not to say there are not people who are naturally monogamous or more monogamous than others. That's absolutely true. It's like everything, it's a spectrum. We all operate in our own very peculiar ways. But I think it's very clear, just from data, just from raw statistics, that things like marriage, binary relationships just don't serve the vast majority of us. You can see that from how many marriages end, how many marriages don't work, how the rates of people having affairs and divorces and whatnot. It's really interesting. It's very clear that people are seeking more, that they seek something outside of that structure from different people. And I've always been I'm not possessive of my partners, of my lovers, and that's been a real source of contention in the past, by the way. I don't get jealous, like at all. And a lot of people want you to be. A lot of people want you to be because that's what they think relationships are. They want you to be jealous. They want you to engage in the argument and be possessive. And I'm not. I don't regard anyone as my property. I don't care. And I've never cared if my partners want to sleep with someone else. As long as they're careful, as long as they're honest about it, fine. If they're getting something else from that person, that's fine. And by the way, it is not because I don't have profound affection for them or because I don't love them. It's just that I don't feel as though I possess them. I don't have a problem with people engaging in different types of relationship with different people and getting different things from those relationships. I never have. And it's not control. This is the other thing people have, but a lot of people who can't identify with this don't understand is they think that it's contrived. They think that you're doing it to be like contrarian or out of some performance, and it's just not that. I'm being sincere. This is another thing that I have quite big issues with. Sincerity is important to me. Sincerity is really important. And again, this is a problem where I brush up against so much in culture and society and so much that's prescribed because I believe that in the UK we are a culture built on insincerity. We are a culture built upon aesthetic performative games. Everything we do, our politics, our relationships, our careers, our job interviews, all this bullshit, our media, it's all a fucking game. It's all this game of masks and pantomimes where people say the right things and because they feel obliged to, and that's part of the job, that's part of the role to perform in the right way. That's part of the relationship to perform in the right way. Relationships very often I find in the UK are very aesthetic. There's nothing sincere under them. It's all about how they appear to other people. Our fucking homes. Wander into most homes in the UK and I find them insincere. They're like show homes. They are decorated and put together in such a way as to demonstrate something to other people, not to be comfortable for the people who live in them. I love it when I go into someone's home and it's a mess. It's cluttered, there's books and stuff everywhere. There's evidence of their interests, like there are rock collections or something. Give me that any fucking day over going into someone's house and finding it just newly done and everything in its place and things like ornaments placed everywhere to make it, oh, fuck that that. I hate it. It's insincere and I find it neurotic. I find it neurotic. To me, when I go into homes like that, I get the sensation of the home itself shrieking at me because I think that's what the person who lives there is doing. They're kind of aggressively picking me up and trying to shriek in my face, I am this, I am this, I am this, I am this. Look at this. This is an expression of me. I am this. And I'm like, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. It's the emperor's new clothes. The lady doth protest way too much, you know? You're trying to assert to me an identity that you want or think that you should have, but it's driving you mad. And that's what I find in so much of our operations and our engagements and our systems in the UK. It's a culture built on insincerity, and it's killing us. It is driving us fucking mad, and it's expressing itself through our culture, through our politics, through so much in us. This is one thing I love about Pride, and it's something I love about the queer community in general. You will find expressions of sincerity throughout. We are often very sincere about our sexual identities and our desires and the way we function in that regard. We are often very sincere about the way we want to look and the way we want to dress and whatnot, regardless of if it makes us look ridiculous or absurd in other people's eyes. Fuck off, you know. It's we it we are not for the most part, and there are queer people like this, unfortunately, but they are more of a minority than they are in straight cultures and communities. Um, we are not bothered about plays of things like masculinity and femininity. Those things are bullshit. There's a broad spectrum of queer identity that ranges from people who are naturally quite feminine to people who are naturally quite masculine, of both sexes and everything in between. And people tend to be very sincere about that. They do what they feel. They do what makes them feel good and happy and fulfilled. And I love that. It's why I prefer engaging. I do generally prefer engaging with queer people. I'll be 100% honest. I do collectively, communally, because there's none of the bullshit. There's none of the neurotics. There's none of the nonsense. There's none of the laddish, blokish, hyper masculine. Everything's got to be antagonistic. I've got to assert myself. Fucking nonsense. The neurotic emperor's new clothes, ego-driven, insecure, frightened little internal child bullshit. We have our own problems, don't get me wrong, but and of course we do, because of the way culture is set up, because of our history, we have our own problems. I suffer with anxiety like you wouldn't fucking believe. I have a real problem with anxiety, and a lot of it is internalized. I kind of one of the things I do, and this is the psychologist, the amateur psychologist coming out again. One of the things I do is I tend to try to dominate social situations. I tend to try and be the center of attention, and I'm very sort of theatrical and very eloquent and very performative, and I love to do this. I love to do this basically. Have long, long spiels and discussions and things, and be very eloquent about things. And it's a kind of mask. It is a kind of mask. It's not a conscious one, but it's one I've developed as a mechanism for getting over my social anxiety. It allows me to operate in social situations which would otherwise cripple me. And it has helped a great deal. It has helped a great, great deal, as has practicing it here, quite frankly. Um, yeah, it's one of the reasons I love Pride, because people can be what they want. People can do as they wish. People can express however they want, and it's something I like about queer communities in general. There is a certain honesty to it. There is a certain honesty to it. In the gay guy circles in which I operate, there really is this openness and frankness and honesty about things like sex and things like desire and, you know, relationships and all that kind of thing. And I really love that. I really love that. That quite frankly, there's stuff that straight culture at the moment, particularly male culture, could learn from the queer community. There really is. Because I don't know whether you've noticed, guys, we'll probably talk about this in another video, but the straights aren't all right at the moment. I can tell you, they are several shades of crazy, particularly straight men. Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ.